The first thing I saw wasn't the people. It was my sign, my laminated, very clearly worded private property sign, just drifting down the creek like it had given up on life. And I remember standing there thinking, all right, either I'm losing my mind, or someone's about to regret a really bad decision. My name's Caleb Turner, and about a year ago I bought a piece of land just outside a small town in western Tennessee. Nothing fancy, just quiet woods, a modest house, and a stretch of creek that ran along the back end of the property. And that creek, legally speaking, was mine, not shared, not community access, not sort of yours. I'm talking deed in writing, surveyed, documented, stamped, and filed mine. I didn't buy it to make trouble. Honestly, I bought it because I wanted less of that, less noise, less people, less of the kind of neighbor who measures your grass with a ruler and sends you passive-aggressive letters, which, ironically, is exactly what I ended up with. Now, the neighborhood next to my land had an HOA, and I wasn't part of it. Not technically, not legally, not even by accident. But that didn't seem to stop the president, a woman named Linda Carver, from acting like she'd been personally elected mayor of everything within a 1-mile radius. Linda had that energy, you know the kind. Always walking fast like she's late to something important, big sunglasses, clipboard tucked under her arm, talking in that tone that sounds friendly until you realize she's not asking, she's telling. The first time she showed up at my place, she smiled and complimented my fence, then immediately suggested I repaint it because it didn't match the community aesthetic, which, again, I wasn't even part of. I laughed it off back then, figured she just didn't understand the property lines, maybe thought I'd eventually fold and join their little club, but over the next few weeks, the notes started showing up. Mailbox not compliant, shed placement questionable, vegetation unmanaged, and every time I'd either ignore it or send a polite response pointing out the obvious. I don't belong to your HOA. So when I saw that sign floating down the creek, yeah, I had a feeling exactly who was behind it. I walked down the bank, boots sinking a little into the damp soil, picked up the sign, water dripping off the edges, and that's when I heard it, laughter, soft music, like someone had turned my property into a weekend hangout. I rounded the bend, and there they were. Linda, 2 other board members I'd seen lurking around before, and a couple folding chairs set up like they were at a tailgate, fishing lines in the water, a cooler open, drinks sweating in the sun, and a little Bluetooth speaker playing some low jazz like they were starring in their own backyard commercial. I just stood there for a second, taking it in, because sometimes your brain needs a moment to catch up with how ridiculous reality just got. Linda turned first, slow, like she already knew I was there, gave me that same smile, the one that always felt a little too polished. Caleb, she said, like we were old friends. We were just enjoying the creek a bit. Hope you don't mind. I held up the soggy sign. You mean the one that says private property? One of the others, a guy named Mark I think, chuckled under his breath like I'd just made a cute joke. Linda waved a hand. Oh, come on. It's just a creek. It's not like you're using it all the time. And that right there, that sentence, that's when the switch flipped for me. I stepped a little closer, not aggressive, just firm. Let me make this real simple, I said, keeping my voice even. This land, including this stretch of water, is mine. You're trespassing. One of the women rolled her eyes. That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? I shook my head, pulled out a folded copy of my deed I kept in a zip bag in my jacket, and held it up. Bridge to the oak tree. That's the boundary. You're inside it. Linda barely glanced at it. Well, the board voted last month to allow community access to natural features, so technically, I cut her off. You can't vote yourselves access to something you don't own. There was a pause, just a second, where I thought maybe this would click for her. It didn't. She took a sip of her drink, like we were discussing lawn decor. Caleb, we're not hurting anything. And honestly, we've been coming down here for a few weeks now. It's been perfectly fine. That part landed harder than anything else she said. Weeks. Not once, not twice, weeks. I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue further, because in that moment I realized something important. I didn't need to convince them. I just needed proof. I turned, started walking back toward my house, and I could feel them watching me, probably thinking they'd just won some kind of neighborhood standoff. But the second I hit my porch steps, I was already pulling up my camera system. I'd installed 4 cameras when I moved in, nothing fancy but solid, wired, backed up to a private server, no cloud. No easy way to tamper with it. I hadn't checked the creek camera in a while. Last time was when some raccoon decided my tackle box looked like a buffet, but now, with Linda's little, "We've been coming here for weeks," comment echoing in my head, I had a very specific reason. The footage took a second to load, and when it did, I didn't even realize I'd stopped breathing. Because they weren't just sitting there fishing. They were building something. And not just that, they'd already changed my land in ways I hadn't even noticed yet. I remember leaning back in that kitchen chair, one hand gripping the edge of the table a little tighter than I meant to, just staring at the screen like if I watched it long enough it might somehow make less sense. But it didn't. If anything, every second that passed just made it worse. The first clip was from about 3 weeks back, early morning. And there was Linda, same sunglasses, same brisk walk, except this time she wasn't carrying a clipboard. She was holding a chainsaw. And I wish I was exaggerating that. I really do. But no. She and 2 guys from the HOA board, one of them a tall guy named Russell who handled their property review committee, were standing right next to a dogwood tree on my side of the creek, my tree, and before I could even process what I was seeing, the saw kicked on, and they dropped it like it was nothing, no hesitation, no discussion, just cut it down, dragged the trunk a few feet, and set it up like a bench. I actually said out loud, to no one, "You've got to be kidding me," but the footage just kept going. 2 days later, same spot. They came back with bags of gravel, dumped it along the muddy slope leading down to the water, spreading it out like they were landscaping a public park. Then another clip, different day, a rope swing tied to a low-hanging branch of a sycamore. And then the one that really got me, a group of kids, maybe 6 or 7 of them, splashing around in the creek while a couple of adults sat in folding chairs, drinks in hand, watching like this was some kind of weekend. Retreat. I pushed away from the table so fast the chair scraped loud across the tile, and I just stood there, pacing a little, running a hand through my hair. Because this wasn't just annoying anymore. This wasn't even just disrespect. This was full-on trespassing, property damage, and liability waiting to happen on my land. If one of those kids got hurt, guess whose name was on the deed mine? So I did what I probably should have done the second I saw them down there. I started making calls. First one was to a friend of mine, Rachel Dunn, real estate attorney, sharp as a blade and not the kind of person you want on the other side of a dispute. We'd crossed paths a couple years back when I helped her with a property survey issue, so she owed me a favor, and when I told her what I had, sent over a few stills from the footage, she went quiet for a second, then just said, "Caleb, this is bad." For them. That was the first time all day I felt something close to relief. Second call was to the county sheriff's office, and by mid-afternoon, Deputy Harris was standing in my kitchen, arms crossed, watching the clips on my tablet. He didn't say much at first, just let it play. Tree coming down, gravel going in, kids in the water, and when it ended, he let out this slow breath and shook his head. "They altered your land without permission," he said, almost like he was listing items off a report already forming in his mind. Cut down a tree, installed structures, invited minors onto private property. Yeah. This isn't just a warning situation. I asked him straight, "Can you cite them?" He looked at me, then back at the screen. "We're past citations. You want to press charges." And I didn't hesitate, not even a second. Yes. There's a strange kind of quiet that settles in after you make a decision like that. Not relief exactly, more like clarity. Like the situation finally has edges again. Harris nodded, told me he'd file it under criminal trespass and property damage. Maybe more depending on what the county decided once they reviewed everything. Then he gave me a case number and said someone would be in touch. I walked him out to his cruiser, stood there in the driveway watching him pull away, and for the first time since that morning, I felt like I wasn't the one on the defensive anymore. That night, Rachel called me back. "I pulled your deed and the easement details," she said, and I could hear papers shifting on her end. "Your boundary extends past the creek's north bank. That tree they cut? Fully on your property. And anything they built down there, the gravel path, the swing, that counts as unauthorized structural alteration." I leaned against the counter, letting that sink in. "So what are my options?" She didn't hesitate. "We go civil and criminal. Injunction, damages, legal fees, and Caleb, there's something else." Her tone shifted a little, sharper. "I checked the HOA filings." "Yeah. You're not in it." I blinked, actually laughed once like I'd misheard her. "What do you mean I'm not in it?" I mean, your parcel isn't listed under their jurisdiction. You're adjacent, not included. They've been sending you notices, fines, all of it, without legal authority. I straightened up slowly. So every letter, every warning. Potentially fraudulent. That was the moment everything flipped. Because up until then, I thought I was dealing with an overbearing HOA president who didn't understand boundaries. But this was different. This was someone knowingly pushing authority they didn't have and betting no one would call them on it. I smiled, actually smiled for the first time that day. All right, I said, then let's call them on it. The next morning I drove straight to the county courthouse, filed a formal complaint, trespass, vandalism, unauthorized land use. Rachel had already drafted the civil suit by the time I got back to my truck, sent it over for review, clean and precise, every detail backed by timestamps and documentation. That afternoon, I went back down to the creek, took photos of everything, the stump where the dogwood had been, the gravel crunching under my boots, the rope swaying slightly like it didn't know it had just become evidence, even the empty can someone had left behind. I printed copies, handed them over to the sheriff's office, and then I waited. Except I didn't have to wait long. Because word travels fast in neighborhoods like that, faster than official notices, faster than paperwork. By the time the citations were served 2 days later, people were already talking. I was unloading groceries when my neighbor, Frank, wandered over. Older guy, retired mechanic. Always had that look like he'd seen just about everything and wasn't surprised by any of it. Heard you got the HOA served, he said, scratching behind his dog's ears. That true? I nodded. Sure is. He let out a low whistle. About time somebody did. That evening, more people stopped by, a young couple from down the street, a nurse named Angela, even a guy I'd only seen once or twice walking his dog, and they all had stories. Fines that didn't make sense, warnings over things that weren't violations, letters that felt more like intimidation than regulation. And as I listened, something started forming in my head. This wasn't just about my creek anymore. So I started a folder, digital, organized, labeled it HOA Overreach. Every complaint, every photo, every notice, all of it went in there. If they wanted to play authority, fine, we'd bring receipts. By the weekend, the HOA board called an emergency meeting at their community center. I didn't go, didn't need to, but Rachel did, representing me, and she brought copies, footage stills, legal filings, documentation showing I wasn't even part of their jurisdiction. And from what she told me later, the room went quiet real fast. Linda tried to keep her composure, tried to frame it like a misunderstanding, but you can only do that for so long when the evidence is sitting right in front of you. And that's when things started to crack. Things didn't fall apart all at once. It was slower than that. Messy, eh? Like watching something rot from the inside out, where at first you just notice a crack, then another, and before you know it, the whole structure can't hold its own weight anymore. By Monday morning, word had spread through the neighborhood like a brush fire, and not the quiet, polite kind either. People were talking out loud now, comparing notes, pulling out old letters, rereading fines they'd paid without ever questioning them. I heard Linda had tried to argue with the deputy when the citations were served, something about community authority and shared resources, but that kind of language doesn't hold up too well when it's sitting next to a stack of evidence and a legal complaint with your name on it. One of the board members stepped down almost immediately. Russell, the tall guy from the footage, suddenly had personal matters to attend to. Another tried to distance herself, claimed she didn't really support the creek use, that she'd just gone along with it, which, honestly, didn't land very well with anyone who'd seen her sitting there in a lawn chair with a drink while kids splashed around on land she didn't own. Linda, though, she doubled down. Of course she did. People like that don't back off easily, not when they've built their whole identity around being in charge. But here's the thing about pushing too far. Eventually, someone pushes back harder. The sheriff's office followed through, not just warnings, not just a slap on the wrist, formal charges for trespass, property damage, and endangerment. The fines alone stacked up into the tens of thousands, and the best part, at least from a legal standpoint, was that they couldn't use HOA funds to cover it, because technically, none of it had been authorized within any legitimate jurisdiction. That meant personal liability, their names, their money, their problem. I didn't celebrate it. Not really. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a moment, standing on my porch that evening, where I felt something close to satisfaction, not because they were in trouble, but because for once, the line actually mattered. Over the next few days, I went back down to the creek and started undoing what I could, cleared out the gravel, took down what was left of the swing, planted a new dogwood where the old one had been cut, and it was quiet again, the kind of quiet I'd wanted when I bought the place in the first place. Frank walked by one afternoon with his dog, gave me a nod. "Feels different now," he said. I nodded back. "Yeah, it does." And for a moment, I thought maybe that was the end of it. Lesson learned, lines redrawn, everyone moves on. It wasn't. About 3 days later, a white SUV pulled up near the edge of my property, didn't come down the driveway, just sat there idling. I was inside, watching through the screen door, arms crossed, and I saw the driver step out, take a few photos of the creek, the new tree, even my mailbox, then get back in and leave without saying a word. It didn't take a genius to guess where that came from. I called Rachel, told her what I saw, and she didn't even sound surprised. "They're trying to find another angle," she said. "Something zoning related, maybe environmental. When people lose control, they look for leverage anywhere they can." And she was right, just not in the way either of us expected. Because when the county got involved again, it didn't point back at me, it pointed right back at them. Turns out, once you open the door to an investigation, people start looking a little closer, not just at the original complaint, but at everything surrounding it. An inspector came out, walked the perimeter with me, checked boundaries, flagged survey points, and then he paused near the edge of a neighboring lot, pointed off toward a section of land I hadn't paid much attention to before. "That community garden they've got set up," he said. "You know part of that's not theirs, right?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" He tapped his clipboard. "Encroaches onto county land. About 20 feet. And just like that, the story got bigger. Within a week, it wasn't just the sheriff's office knocking on doors, it was county code enforcement, environmental agencies, people asking questions about permits, about land use, about alterations made without approval. That gravel they'd spread near my creek? It had disrupted a protected runoff channel, something I hadn't even known existed, and suddenly, that little beautification project turned into a state-level violation. And the wild part, I didn't even file that complaint. Someone else did. A retired biology teacher from down the street, quiet guy, barely said 2 words most days. Turns out he'd been documenting drainage issues for months and just needed a reason to send it in. I guess my situation gave him one. That's when everything really started unraveling. The HOA's lawyer dropped them, conflict of interest, from what I heard, something about withheld information and misrepresentation. Internal emails got pulled into the investigation, financial records too, and once those were opened up, it was like someone flipped on a light in a room nobody had cleaned in years. Payments that didn't match invoices, reimbursements for equipment that never showed up, money routed through vendors connected to board members, small things at first glance, but together, a pattern. Linda's name was all over it. She was arrested about 2 weeks later. Early morning, no sirens, just quiet and final. I didn't see it happen, but everyone heard about it within the hour. Charges included falsifying records, misuse of funds, and conspiracy tied to some of those internal approvals. One of the other board members went down with her, the same ones who'd been sitting by my creek like they owned it. The HOA account got frozen, operations basically stopped overnight, and for the first time since I moved in, that whole authority structure they'd built just vanished. I finalized my civil case with Rachel not long after, damages for the tree, for the land, legal fees, everything. The judge didn't take long. The evidence was clear, the jurisdiction issue even clearer. Full payout, plus an order requiring the HOA to formally acknowledge their boundaries in writing. But the part that stuck with me wasn't the money, it was what happened after. The residents, the actual people living there, they didn't try to rebuild the HOA the same way. They voted for a complete overhaul, then eventually dissolution. No more fines, no more enforcement letters, no more one person deciding what everyone else's property should look like. Just neighbors, talking to each other, figuring things out without threats attached. A few weeks later, they invited me to a community potluck at the park. I almost didn't go, figured it might be awkward, but I showed up anyway. Someone handed me a plate, someone else a drink, and after a while, they asked if I wanted to say something. I didn't have a speech prepared, didn't think I needed one. I just stood there for a second, looked around, and said, I didn't set out to fight anybody. I just wanted my land to stay mine. There was a pause, then I added, but I guess sometimes, if you don't draw the line, someone else will, and they won't draw it where you want. It wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. That night, I walked back along the creek, same path where all of this started. The new tree was taking root, water moving steady. No chairs, no music, no one pretending it belonged to them. Just quiet, real quiet. And I remember thinking, it took a whole lot of noise to get back to this. Now here's the part one still go back and forth on. Because yeah, everything worked out, at least on paper. Lines were enforced, people were held accountable, and the system corrected itself in the end. But sometimes I wonder, if I hadn't said anything, if I'd just let it slide, avoided the hassle, kept the peace, would things have gotten this far? Or were they already headed there, just waiting for someone to finally push back? I don't know. And that's what I want to ask you. If you were in my position, would you have done the same thing, taken it all the way, legal action, charges, everything? Or would you have tried to handle it differently? Maybe keep it quiet, avoid turning neighbors into enemies? Where do you draw that line between keeping the peace and standing your ground? Let me know what you think, because I've heard arguments both ways, and honestly, I'm still not sure there's a perfect answer.